The 1980s are considered to have been a big turning point in the history of comics, but discussions of comics in the 80s tend to focus on the same 2 or 3 titles: Watchmen, Dark Knight, Mouse. But what were the other important comics of the 80s? This week, Emmet and Kumar discuss a book on this topic called The Other 1980s, a collection of essays edited by Brannon, Costello, and Brian Cremins. First, if you appreciate the work we do on this podcast, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Emmet.
And this is Kumar.
And today we're talking about the other 1980s. So what is that? Well, this is a book subtitled Reframing Comics' Crucial Decade. And it's edited by Brannon, Costello and Brian Cremins. And this is actually the second time we've talked about this book on this podcast, in that I interviewed Brian Cremins about Shazam. Because Brian wrote a fantastic book called Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia. I've sung his praises on Deconstructing Comics a couple of times now. And in our conversation, he mentioned that he was working on an anthology all about the 80s comics that tend not to get mentioned because of that opening paragraph that always has to Dark Knight Returns, Mouse and Watchmen, redefine comics in the 1980s. So Cremins and Costello, their project here is to feature writing from a number of other comic scholars about other 1980s pivotal works that maybe don't get their due. And I shared this with you.
Yep.
And you made a short list of things you wanted to talk about.
Well, okay, so I'm 47. I started reading comics when I was about 12, 13 in 1987, 1988. And it occurred to me when I went through the table of contents that actually I haven't read many of these comics, barely any of them. The thing that, there's an article about Robotech in there, and that was a thing that really exploded my brain. Because if we were at my house, you'd see it's like Dune. There's Robotech posters, there's a shelf of just Robotech stuff and figures and books and all that. And that was one of so when the comic shop opened in my hometown around 87, I think it was February 87, this is a very long, boring story, but
go for it.
My allowance was $1 a week. And a comic cost 95 cents plus 10 cents of tax, $1.05. So I could barely afford them. And I actually had to borrow a nickel from my dad against my next week's allowance anytime I wanted to buy a comic. I would make him drive me all over town because there was only one place I could get Transformers comics, at this gas station across the river. And then he'd have to drive me up to the bookstore to buy the John Byrne Superman. But this comic shop opened, and I started with Transformers and Superman. And then my brother, you need to have minimum 4 titles to have a pull list. So my brother was in on 2, my younger brother. But he was kind of flaky and he liked spending his money on candy and stuff. So eventually I just had to drop out and I had to reorganize my finances and stuff. But eventually I came on to, whenever I could, whenever I had the money, I would buy a Robotech comic.
Yeah.
And something that's not talked about much in the article in here is that Robotech was serial. It was not like Transformers or G.I. Joe. It was like an ongoing storyline. And you couldn't watch every episode. You would miss episodes. You wouldn't know what was going on. And the comics are super important access point. And to figure out the story and just put the whole thing together. And at one stage, later on, especially in the Macross series, they added these 2 artists, Mike Leake and Mike Chen. And they were awesome. In the artwork on the other 2 Robotech titles wasn't nearly, it was just serviceable. It was just there to produce the episode on paper. But these guys were really, really good. And I even own one. I only own 2 pieces of original art. One is a Swamp Thing page, the anatomy lesson, page 1 from the 80s, and also a Robotech page.
Yeah.
So it was a really big deal for me. But the rest of the stuff in this book was really, it was stuff I saw on shelves. And also in 88, 87, 88, if a title said suggested for mature readers, I wouldn't even bother trying to take it up to the counter and buy it.
Yeah.
And one of the things, Doug mentions Slash Maraud, was I would see advertisements, and a lot of the comics in here I saw ads for.
Yes.
Neil the Horse, you'd see ads for it, or you'd see it on the shelf somewhere. You're like, what is that weird thing?
Yeah.
And not really, wouldn't buy it because I was a kid and I wasn't even that interested in something like that at that stage. So this book was pretty fascinating. I mean, I only read 5. I read 6 articles.
Yeah.
I love that there's 2 articles about women's comics in there. That was fascinating too. That I think this is the only one that gets 2 feature articles.
Yes, although to be fair, Elfquest and Cerebus and Neil the Horse get mentioned repeatedly.
Yeah.
And as much as I called out all those academic articles which spend the bulk of their time on Watchmen and Mouse and Dark Knight Returns, there are 1 or 2 offenders in this book as well. There's at least one chapter which opened with like, after Watchmen, and I was like, oh no, don't do that. But as you say, there are articles in here which are unpacking. It's almost like comic book hauntology,
right?
In that we're revisiting these potential alternative paths comics could have taken.
Yes.
With clear incentive to take them.
Yes.
Commercial incentive, cultural incentive. Amethyst is a great example of this.
Yeah.
Neil the Horse is a great example of this, where there was clearly... Elfquest, obviously.
Yeah.
There was clearly a market, there was an audience, particularly among women readers, for these titles. And the direct market, which is now under firmer control than the general magazine retail market, decides not to go down those paths.
Yeah.
And I feel like this book captures the sense of what could have been.
Yes.
Had, it been recognised.
Yeah.
How valid these works were at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a share of responsibility lies on critics as well, the comics critics. Because they would, and there's a degree of misogyny at work there too, where they would, dismiss something like the Peonies and Elfquest for being too girly.
Right.
Or being too gay.
Right.
Frankly.
Right.
So, that was fascinating.
I'm sorry, I've asked you 100 times, and you don't have to say out loud, but
sure.
Are you older than me?
I'm younger than you.
You're younger. Okay, so this is even further for you.
Well, I was born in 1980.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm familiar with a lot of the stuff.
Okay.
And my big thing coming up was Transformers, the UK Transformers with Simon Furman.
I've got a couple of those.
And
yeah.
That's why I was interested in Robotech, because the article on Robotech, and you can talk about this if you like, but the article on Robotech, they were so the hooks were so deep in there.
Yeah.
The comic book had to translate the anime or the animation directly to the page. And that's a huge ask, right? Whereas what Furman did was Furman located characters that Mattel wanted to market that weren't part of the main storyline. And he said, okay, well, my story is about these characters.
Yeah.
And Weight Wash, which is another podcast, they just did an entire episode all about the UK Transformers run. And it's fascinating stuff. I mean, and they were quite saying, look, there's still some really interesting things going on in Transformers and G.I. Joe, but rip away the veil of nostalgia, and it's not as good as you remember. No. But I found that fascinating. And just quickly in the Robotech chapter, they list a number of other comics franchises based on anime and animation that were very toyetic and based on robots.
Yeah.
So Robotech, obviously. GoBots, sure. Transformers, yes.
Yeah.
Voltron, absolutely. Stariors.
Vaguely remember Stariors.
I don't remember that one at all.
Well, I would only remember it from ads in ads in comics for the toys.
Right.
Which is how. But there was a lot of them, like Sectors, like that insect-based one, and Crystar the Warrior. Yeah, there's a million toy-based things. Robotech was not like any of those because it wasn't based on a toy line per se. It was just a Japanese animation.
Yeah.
The really it's amazing. It came out very diluted and ripped apart and violated the version that we got in the US. And yet it still came out with this really moving anti-war story with this amazing love triangle that why would any 10-year-old be interested in, but was like, who's he going to choose at the end? Yeah. It was something else, man. And and I loved seeing somebody, and he makes kind of the point in there, which...
We should credit the authors. It's Jonathan Alexandratos and Daniel F. Yespik.
Yeah, so there was a role-playing game for Robotech, which I played the hell out of.
Right.
And there was no Transformers role-playing or G.I. Joe role-playing game.
Right.
But I saved my pennies and bought those books for Robotech because I was so into it. And I had a friend that used to... he didn't have a VCR. He would audio record the episodes and play them in the background while we were playing the RPG. This is the kind of weirdo level we were at, but the desperation to kind of immerse ourselves in that.
I find it very funny that Mike Barron produced some Robotech, Genesis Robotech, he's credited here.
Yeah.
And when Brian Cremins, when I interviewed him and he mentioned he's doing this book, the first thing I said to him, like he was halfway through describing, you can go back and listen to the recording, like you can hear me getting, audibly angry with him because I love you, Brian, don't worry about it. But he's talking about this concept for the other 1980s, and I go, oh, so there's a chapter on Nexus.
Right.
No, there isn't. I was saying, what?
Yeah, right.
Mike Barron and Steve Rude is not in here, but there's nothing on Nexus. I don't think he gets a mention.
Did Mike Barron write Badger?
Yes, he did. Yeah. Badger, which is like his Wolverine.
Was that a Comico title?
No, I think that's still first.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. But Comico had newsstand distribution, which is bizarre. Like, I was buying these Robotech comics at, like, the drugstore.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Like, Robotech, I have no experience of. You're grounded in this. I have nothing on Robotech. So this was fascinating for me. And I think a general comment I'll make about all the chapters in this book and all the writers, all the scholars who contributed to the other 1980s, I wanted more. Right? I think a lot of I think there are half a dozen books in here. Yeah. Potentially.
Sure.
But I get that that's what this is doing. It's actually trying to break ground on some scholarship here. Yeah. So I admire what they're doing, but at the same time, I came away going, I need to know more about this. So this bit here in Robotech, I'll what I mentioned before about the development of the comic itself at Comico. See, this is what the artist had to do. The VHS tapes, the raw, early cuts of each animated episode served as our plots. So each series penciler would watch, rewind, and repeat in order to adapt one cartoon episode into 26 pages of sequential art. Photocopies of those pencil pages would go to the series writer, and it was always a he in those days, would draft a script based on the original cartoon, but working to accord with the penciled adaptation thereof. There wasn't much wiggle room, as I recall, for the addition of new material, and it goes on. And they're working with Harmony Gold on this. So this is...
Dana Schutz.
Dana Schutz, yeah. Like, that's egregious.
Yeah.
It's just nightmare working conditions.
Yeah, working on VHS copies too.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Hard to imagine. But I will say, sure, there are whole books in here. So I only read 6 of the articles in it. Some of them are very academic.
Sure.
It's not like general audience reading. You've got to be doing your MA in English Lit, I think, to read some of them. Some of them are very conversational and remember this thing.
Remember berries.
So I kind of get what you're saying, because especially the more academic ones were trying to get at I felt like their focus was very laser sharp. Like, one of the women's comics ones is practically only about bedrooms as a representation of where things happen during girlhood. But it's written in a very academic manner, so it's like 15 pages to get to this point. It's like, we could have a book. There's a lot more going on here.
Yeah.
And women's comics is a really interesting example because in the 70s, when they were being sold through head shops, it was a lot more explicit. There was a lot more sexual stuff in there. Even though they mentioned in one of those articles how they were getting in trouble, even at the head shops, for selling this stuff. But direct market, never going to happen. We know what the direct market was like in the 80s. It was neutered almost literally.
Yeah.
And that's a really fascinating thing about, the 80s specifically, which I'm kind of surprised they didn't go into more in this book, about how that's a prime example of a thing that existed in the 70s and 80s and was vastly different because it was being sold to... They were trying to sell them to dudes.
Yeah. Their main audience, the direct market's main audience, is men.
Yeah.
Young men, middle-aged men. That's their audience, and that's what they assume is their readership.
Yeah.
And what does get explored in this with the other women's comics chapter, which is fascinating as well, is the idea of Reagan's moral majority.
Oh yeah.
Rolling in, and then this culture war. So the women comic creators would be immediate victims of that because a lot of their work is focused on feminism and this idea of bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
And that's depicted in these comics, and that's something that they're discussing in these comics. So that's out. No, can't have that. And I again, that's where I talk about like the road not taken, because I feel as if a movement was rolling in and it just got cut off, straight away.
And at the same time, we had the black and white boom that was happening in the 80s. So, I mean, Neil the Horse, which is one we will talk about, because there's an article in there, a full article about Neil the Horse, was a really oddball comic which had songs with sheet music in it.
Fascinating,
and stories, like full, huge text stories with illustrations, and it would have some comics, and sometimes it would continue from issue to issue, and sometimes not. It was just... It was just everything in one package.
She's experimenting with bricolage. Like she's reclaiming like advertising. She's reclaiming like old magazine format styles, and then the sheet music sequence you mentioned. It's a silent sequence. It's a dance scene with Fred Astaire.
Yeah,
incredible.
But sometimes there's songs like she'll have the lyrics at the bottom, and she's got somebody to transcribe the music, like the tune for her. But the thing about it ran, I think, for 16 issues, which in 2021 is unthinkable. I can't imagine Diamond even agreeing to carry it, because Diamond has these, quote unquote quotas that they're like, okay, if we think you can sell 500 or 1,000 copies, then we will accept you into the catalog previews. Hard to imagine that Neil the Horse would get in there now, and if they did, would it last for 16 issues?
Neil the Horse would be a webcomic now. Neil the Horse would be on a website, and it would have a dedicated fan base on that website, and it wouldn't go near the direct market. And that's what's happened a lot, where a lot of experimentation is now limited to the online space.
Right.
But then the direct market is headhunting from some of these spaces. When they actually do achieve a certain notoriety, then they get pulled in, which is just the commercial reality of this closed shop that exists. But I think what's notable about this is, you could go to a magazine shop and you could buy some of these. Like, they were available to purchase. Yeah. And you're right, that's simply not feasible anymore. Yeah. Unless it's like a specialty shop. Not a comic book shop, a specialty shop. Yeah. Probably like the equivalent of head shops still.
Right.
Whatever's out there.
Well, we used to have Polyester here on Brunswick Street. Which is no longer there. But they had a comics section in the back of all sorts of weirdo stuff.
They covered Frank Candellaro's stuff as well. I remember they were very proud of that. And there was a lot of really interesting stuff in Polyester. And then when that went, that was like a vacuum just opening up, because all of a sudden it was like, oh, there's nothing now. Yeah. That space simply doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. I wish I'd given them more custom. I honestly do.
No, I regret it now. I regret more the day I went looking for it and it was not there. Yeah. Just plain old not there. And then I looked up on my phone. It's like, it closed 3 years ago or something. Bad. But I did make some purchases in there. It was super fun to look around. It was just this weirdo off the wall. It was the equivalent, 2000s equivalent of a head shop almost.
Yeah. So Robotech, as we mentioned, that's fascinating stuff. I don't have as much of an anchor in as you do. That was one of the chapters I felt I needed more from. Yeah. In that I was going, I need to know more of the context of this. Yeah. I don't have that background. So how did you find that?
Well, a lot of the articles don't really talk about the quality of the work.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very academic. It's like, this is what it is. And it doesn't say whether this is a great strip or this is exciting or this makes you feel compassion or something. There's very little of that kind of discussion. And I think that part of Robotech, I mean, for me, it was the emotional... You don't get attached to Snake Eyes in G.I. Joe. He's just a cool dude, if you know what I mean. Whereas Robotech, like, key characters are getting killed off. And you're like, what is this? This is not... And we kind of knew... And even though it had come over in a totally corrupted form, you could tell it was a Japanese show. It was like, this is not American. This is from another country.
I guess that's one of the main points of the article, which is the de-Japanification of Robotech.
Yeah, they couldn't do it completely. It was still... They changed the names. They did all that stuff. They tried to, but they couldn't. Certain characters couldn't be changed. Lin Min Mei had to stay Chinese in it. There were certain things that just... There were no getting around it. And you're like... And people are drawn with these huge eyes and like... swooshing the speed lines, all that kind of stuff is in it. And you're like... And just the level of drama that was happening was not like... It wasn't like a reset to the start of the episode at the end of 20 minutes. It's like, okay, something's going to happen next episode. And I can't... Somebody's getting killed off and you're not going to see that character again. And even Voltron was like that before it came over because Sven... In the original Japanese, Sven got killed.
Right.
But in the Americanization, he just got injured and put in some prison somewhere. And then the princess came in and took over. So they were really trying to make these things look like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. But, even Voltron, which is, probably the easiest, couldn't quite do it. Gotcha Man, which was Battle of the Planets in the US, that was back in the 70s, had this villain that could change gender at will. And watching the show in English, it's just like, for some reason, in some scenes it looks like he's wearing lipstick, and other times he's not, and we don't know what to make of it at the end.
Right.
Because of the way they massage the translation of it for American kids. So, yeah, I kind of feel like he never says... Part of the reason Robotech is so popular was because it was so good, if you know what I mean. And all of these things are like, when Neil the Horse is going for 16 inches, a lot of the conversation is just about, like, look at all the forms that are in this, and this is how it communicates by using all these. But it's never like, this is really good, or this part's boring, or anything like that. Like, I skipped all the text stories when I read it before this episode, because there's a lot of text, and I was like, okay. And, I didn't read all the song lyrics and stuff, but there's something in there kind of for everybody, if you know what I mean, in Neil Horse. But there's most of the articles, so one of the ones we're not talking about that we read beforehand was one about Doug Moench.
Yes.
And I tried reading those comics before this episode, and they're hard work, some of them. Yeah. And articles all about, okay, Moench would go into good and evil modes, and it's about people trying between these warring... All of this is correct. And it's all about... the articles are all about what those comics are, what they're showing, but they're never like, there are too many caption boxes and this is hard to read, or this has been done 100 times before and this is boring. There's none of that angle on it, if you know what I mean.
They're describing more the phenomenon than the substance of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, the reason I mentioned we should talk about Moench is because I'm currently writing a chapter for Sequart for a collection of essays about Moon Knight.
Okay. So
I'm rereading the Moench Moon Knight. And, I thought, we'll leave that for another conversation another day, But I remember reading those Moon Knight comics years ago and really being intrigued by them.
Yeah.
I like Moench. I like some of his stuff. And he's somebody who I think we celebrate for his concepts.
Right.
Like, Moon Knight is a fascinating idea. The superhero who has multiple personas.
Yeah.
To experience multiple facets of life. Whereas the other characters have a superhero identity and a civilian identity, and they can easily skip from one to the other. Moon Knight can't do that. He's diffuse. He's, and then the article here talks about how his love interest, like Marlene, is obliged to address him by whatever identity he happens to be.
He's like a method actor in whatever role he's in,
She's got to put up with that. Frenchie as well. They just got to, I guess we're talking to Steve now.
Yeah.
Which, really interesting stuff. But I always feel as if Moon Knight is as yet unrealized.
Right.
like what Moench was doing. That concept hasn't, and potentially there was editorial pressure not to go down the rabbit hole with this. You know, keep it within the realm of a familiar superhero story. But no, at that time, you know, Marvel had a bunch of, talking about head chops, there was a couple of characters in the wings in Marvel who were partaking, and you can tell. So
what I did like about that Moench article was it talks about comics, like many of these articles, that I've never heard of.
Yeah.
And they were published by DC.
Yeah.
Like, and one was by Eclipse, the Enemy Ace, or not Enemy Ace, Aztec Ace.
Yeah.
I'd heard of that, but never read it. And then there's Lords of the Ultra Realm. Ultra Realm, 13 issues, published by DC. What is this thing? I've never seen it in a back issue bin.
No. They're gone. They're buried. Yeah.
Never saw an ad for it. Like, a lot of these things I did see ads for, and that's how they were kind of in my consciousness. But it's just, and I guess it's not really clear from the article whether Moench actually owned the rights, but because they didn't interact with other DC characters. It was kind of a Wild West time, and I kind of get that impression from this book, and kind of maybe should have talked a little. I'm surprised none of them mentioned the black and white boom and bust that started with Turtles, and there was like 1 million black and white titles.
Turtles comes up a couple of times, though.
Yeah, but they never talk about it in terms of the sales boom that happened, how everyone else suddenly was publishing these black and white books for that period of 2 years or something. And that you could sell tens of thousands of these comics at that time, which is unthinkable now.
Yeah.
Through the direct market. And then they all ended up in the back issue bins because of the non-returnability, which is the whole point of the direct market in the first place.
Coming up, Trina Robbins' underappreciated work, Elfquest goes against Western expectations by copying the Japanese aesthetic of cute drawings in a comic with sex and violence, and more. But first, a reminder to join us for 20th Century TV Trivia, reviews of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and more at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Sawate. My name is Stella, and I am the host of Batgirl to Oracle, the Barbara Gordon podcast. Batgirl to Oracle is a podcast dedicated to Barbara Gordon, the first woman to hold the mantle of Batgirl for an extended period of time, roughly 1967 to 1988. The goal of Batgirl to Oracle is to examine the character's history from her first appearance as Batgirl and continuing through her tenure as Oracle. Each episode looks at a vintage issue of Detective Comics or Batman, as well as other books like Justice League and Freedom Fighters, and modern issues of Batgirl and Birds of Prey. I also keep track of news involving Batgirl and other members of the Bat family, and I have a revolving series of segments like Babs in the Tube, which highlights appearances of Babs in TV and film, Shipper Spotlight, which looks at a variety of comic and pop culture couples, gives their history, and determines whether they are hot or not, Reading with Stella, which could be described as an audio drama, or just me reading a book that relates to Babs or doesn't, and of course, the mainstay literature recommendation. I have been blessed to interview writers Scott Beatty and Chuck Dixon on their Batgirl Year 1 work, Brian Q. Miller on his Batgirl run, Dwayne Swarzynski and Christy Marks on their separate Birds of Prey work, and the creators and actors of the Batgirl Spoiled, the web series. I hope to interview more creators and actors in the future. My goal, most importantly, is to make a fun, entertaining, and thoughtful show that people enjoy and from which they learn. Find the show online at thebatmanuniverse.net and iTunes, and follow the show on Facebook and Twitter at Batgirl to Oracle. Thank you, and fly on, Babs lovers.
Yeah, the other secret hero of this collection is Trina Robbins.
Oh my god, she's all over it.
She's incredible.
She's a giant.
I've seen her speak in public. She's an amazing raconteur. Like her sense of the time. But you know, something we talk about superheroes a lot is costumes.
Yeah. And
the personal nadir for me of superhero costumes was Jim Lee's redesign of the DC characters for the New 52, I think it was.
Yeah.
You know, where suddenly everybody had high collars.
Yeah.
Like terrible design.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the Return of Women's Comics issue. I think so. It's a new issue, and Trina Robbins is the cover artist.
Yeah.
And she's designed the 21st Century Woman.
Yeah, her name is SX/OBJ or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh my god, it's so good.
And she's got this sort of mapping of, it's like that. Have you ever seen that viral magazine article illustration of a cyberpunk guy when he's got all the different attachments?
No, but
okay. Well, it's similar to this. So you've got the microchip memory, electrode nervous system, mammary lactation device, computerized sexually synthesized gyrotron. 0 to 25 RPM acceleration, 360-degree rotation. Anyway, so it's this idea of the compliant woman, in the kitchen and in the bedroom.
It's like an amped up Stepford wife.
Exactly.
Like Cyberpunk Stepford wife.
Cyberpunk Stepford wife. And Trina Robbins is so funny. Like, her fingers on the pulse.
Awesome.
She knows what she's doing. And she's a fascinating character. And we don't talk about her enough. Was it a June Cleaver Memorial Biorhythmic Necklace?
She's almost, I think, because she was kind of an editorial presence. Maybe that's why. I mean, she did a lot of cartooning herself, like that incredible cover that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But she's just kind of holding a lot of stuff together. But she's in a lot of historical scholarship and stuff as well. But a lot of the articles mention her in some respect. The Amethyst one. The article about Amethyst in there also covered a couple of other comics which I'd never heard of, which were published by.
Karen Berger was involved. She was the editor, and it was Jeanette Kahn it's Angel Love.
Angel Love, right?
Barbara Slate. Yeah, sounds really interesting.
It does. It sounds, and it again ran for 12 issues or something like that. Published by DC. And Marvel had this Star Comics line in the 80s, which I remember as well.
Star Comics.
So it was like little kids comics. It was like Heathcliff and Strawberry Shortcake comics and Barbie comics. I think they were all under the Star line. And some of that, and that all kind of... They mention it in one of those articles. That Marvel tried to buy Harvey and failed. So they just set up this thing called Star Comics to publish the same sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was licensed. There was one, it was like John Candy had this cartoon in the 80s. I never heard about this, but he had this cartoon called Camp Candy. I don't know, 6 episodes or 13.
John Candy, the actor.
Yes, but then I found this Star Comic Camp Candy comic once when I was at one of the markets here. And I was like, what is this bizarro thing? So,
there's this great little in the Angel Love section of the Amethyst art. So this chapter, it's written by Aaron Kashtan. The title is Amethyst, Meet Misty, and Angel Love.
Meet Misty.
Historical footnotes or paths not taken.
Yeah.
Misty, my ears pricked up at that because Misty was something that Pat Mills worked on before 2008, which is the UK title. It's a separate book.
Right.
Again, and it's recently returned.
Okay.
So comics aimed at girls.
Yeah.
Right? With this sort of spooky, supernatural element. A lot of falling in love with ghosts. And
so many Japanese horror comics are aimed at girls.
Girls, yeah.
Ghost comics or whatever. Yeah. They enjoy the thrill of being scared. Yeah.
So Angel Love, as we mentioned, it was a DC comic. It's about a young woman, Angel, who she moves to the big city. And she meets this guy called Don. They hit it off.
Yeah.
He's her love interest. And the first issue ends with her discovering Don doing a line.
Yeah.
He's doing...
But it's drawn like a Star comic.
It's got this sort of cutesy style.
So this is another one of those articles where he talks... Was it he that wrote this article?
Yes.
So anyway,
Aaron Kashtan.
Okay, yeah. He mentions the reviews. He pulls some quotes from the Comics Journal or elsewhere that talk about how bad the art is, but he never says...
He never makes a qualitative statement.
He never says what he thinks about the art. He never says, I actually think this is functional art that's serving the purpose or whatever.
I think that's outside of the academic style. That's not... The academic is to give an accounting of this in its time and in its place.
Yes.
It's not to event. It's not a critical piece. Yeah. It's not... And that's where, potentially... With a project like this, you could blur that line a bit, potentially, but within the academic sphere, I don't think you can.
Yeah.
But I quickly just want to mention the letters page of Angel Love issue 5 included a complaint from a concerned mother, S. Moreland, who wrote that Angel Love number 1 was not appropriate for 6 and 10-year-old daughters because of the reference to cocaine. Mm-hmm. Slate, so this is Barbara Slate, who wrote and drew Angel Love. Slate replied, I agree with you that your 6-year-old is too young for Angel Love. My market is geared for 11 to 18-year-old girls. However, some 9-year-old boys read Angel Love, and some adults also read Angel Love. I write for an 11-year-old as I would write for an adult because anything less would be talking down to them. And she goes on to, she's quoted as saying as well that, 11-year-old girls are very smart. Like, why would you be condescending to them?
Yeah.
And so this is, again, this road not taken where you're going, well, this is interesting stuff. And you're sort of, and like, pregnancy comes up, abortion comes up, living in the city, paying rent, all these ideas come up. Yeah. And this is a teen, let's say, preteen teen book.
Drama aimed at,
This is really good. Like, I come to you, Kumar, because I was going, I don't know enough about manga. You know more about manga. I suspect manga has this space for this kind of storytelling for this audience. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wonder with Angel Love if it had been drawn in a different art style. I mean, it's the art style seems to be drawn, like I said, in the same way as the Star comics, which were aimed at the 6-year-olds. And if it had been drawn, if you look at the Raina Telgemeier stuff now, which is aimed at a similar, I'd say, teenage audience. Yeah. It's not drawn that abstract.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mentioned the Elfquest.
Yes.
There's an Elfquest chapter in here too. Elfquest, again, something I don't know enough about. I need to actually get back into it. This chapter is called Delayed Recognition, Wendy and Richard Peeney's Elfquest. And it's written by Isabelle Licari-Guillaume. And
so I didn't read this one.
Right.
But this delayed, how delayed? Because it seems to me that people have recognized the worth of Elfquest for a long time.
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
So I think we tend to recognize Elfquest as having been a commercial success.
Okay.
This is typically referred to as, can you believe it? No, there's a sense of, what are they doing? And this chapter is fascinating because there is a Comics Journal review where a male reviewer for Comics Journal, I couldn't be bothered looking at his name, goes on and on about how the Peenies clearly aren't ethnobiologists because women don't go hunting. And you're going, okay, well, they're elves.
Yeah. Okay.
Point number 1.
Yeah.
Point number 2, comic creators typically aren't ethnobiologists. Point number 3, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
There's that famous Piers Morgan tweet that's been reshared recently where I think he was going off on Daniel Craig for walking around with a baby strapped to his chest.
Okay.
He was carrying the baby, and he said, "Are you saying that James Bond is not a real man?" And people were like, "Yeah, he's not. He's a fictional character." Because this idea of him, Daniel Craig, being offensively effeminate behavior for a man to carry his child. Anyway, all that being said, Elfquest was criticized for being too feminine and being too queer and being a bit,
Are there pull quotes about that?
That's the substance of the article as well, and not being sufficiently Tolkien-derived fantasy. Which, Tolkien fantasy, such a narrow band of fantasy, but there was a commercial impetus for the fantasy market to strictly stick to the Tolkien model. So that makes sense that this guy's on his high horse with this, because that's all he knows. That's what he thinks fantasy is. But this is why I wanted to bring this into this discussion, given what we just talked about, Angel Love. It is worth noting that Peeny developed her graphic style long before Japanese comics began to reach Western audiences. As manga scholar Kari Brienza reminds us, the first Japanese manga ever published in English was Hadashi no Gen, Barefoot Gen, released in 1980 by Eiju Comics under the title of Gen of Hiroshima, and it took another decade for the manga boom to begin in earnest, etc., etc. And she talks about Adam Warren in the 1990s also sort of really bringing in a manga. Peeny was among the first US artists to incorporate elements considered typical of Japanese pop culture into a generally Western treatment of the body. Like shoujo manga characters, her frail elves have large eyes, elaborate clothing and hairstyles, and emphatically expressive body language. The point is that Peeny was depicting the events in her story, which had violence, which had action, which had sexuality, not graphic sex, but certainly sexuality at work. The art style was cute. And it was confusing for people. Because they don't understand. And she's saying, well, I read Astro Boy, and I read all these manga from the 60s and 70s, where the art style would be cute, but something devastating is happening. And she takes that model.
This is what Scott McCloud called masking, right? Where you have the realistic backgrounds and the simplified cartoonish characters so that the reader can project themselves onto the characters.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm completely convinced by that argument, but I can see how it makes sense.
There's a quote here from somebody called Fletcher. I loved the tension created when what looked like sugary cuteness came up against horrible brute violence.
Yeah.
It was such an extreme dynamic. Nothing was safe. Cuteness doesn't mean a character would survive, and the violence was portrayed so honestly and unsparingly. So I appreciate that, and I think that's such an interesting point of inquiry. Again, where Western comics have this house style, this emphasis on realistic body types or exaggerated body types, and there's a push and pull between those two within Western comics. So violence then is nominally realistic, but the shock of it is reduced.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Whereas
Good
the shock
point.
of violence here is more profound.
Excellent point, yeah.
That's why I'm curious to now read Elfquest.
Yes.
Well, this sounds fascinating. Let's read this.
Yeah. No, I certainly had friends that were reading it religiously in the 80s. In fact, one of the guy that recorded Robotech off the TV on audio cassette, was a very close follower of Elfquest. But it was kind of a fringe thing. It was like...
Well, yeah, I had a colleague years ago who's Russian, and I got she was obsessed with Elfquest.
Right.
And I got the impression from her that maybe it was a bit of samizdat, smuggled... I think they were smuggling Elfquest into Russia. Because you're in a communist Soviet Russia at the time.
Right.
So, there was this sense of, Elfquest is amazing,
Right.
So I think it had, again, this idea that keeps coming up in this book, the potential reach of these works was so large, but it was stymied by this presupposed commercial reality.
Yes. Well, I think there was a commercial reality, which I think one of the women's comics articles talks about how those shops were really not comfortable for women to go into, even if you had the comics there.
Exactly. Because, but that's my point. They're aiming it only at men. They want men.
Yes.
They don't want that audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was one of the things that when I first came to Australia and I went to places like All Star Comics, I commented on, it's bright and open and there's space.
Yes.
This is so unusual for a comic book store. And women can come in here and not be hit on? That's crazy.
One of those articles, maybe it's the Angel Love one, talks about a shop called Dreamweaver or something that really tried to be that shop that had a section for girls' comics. Because they mentioned, too, that they were... It's direct market craziness that all the comics were... Like, Angel Love would be shelved next to Angel and the Ape. Like next to DC alphabetically. It would be, that kind of thing. You'd have to go look in the superhero section.
I think the person who wrote the Angel Love and Untitled Chapter mentions that they assumed it was Angel and the Ape.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And then they're like, oh no, it's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
Angel
It's something I've never heard of.
Angel
the writer had never heard of.
Is a cheesecake comic.
Yeah.
Angel is this beautiful woman, Ape is an ape. So it's very sort of innuendo series. And then you got Angel Love, which is sort of girl in town.
It's almost like Kathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, Kathy, I interviewed Jamie Loftus for Deconstruct Comics about Kathy. She did a ACK cast all about Kathy Comics. And that's a recurring idea in that as well, that it was just rejected out of hand because it was about women, it was about a story about women, women's experience of living in the city, therefore invalid. De facto, Yeah.
What were the other articles?
You wanted to talk about Neil the Horse as well. We
kind of
touched on it.
talked about that a bit. I don't remember how I first encountered... I feel like I definitely saw it on a shelf, but it must have been at the Beguiling in the early 2000s or the 90s. Because they sometimes have oddball back issues on the shelf, on the racks. But I'd see ads for it and just be like, what is it? It's such a strange, it's almost like Crazy Cat.
That's clearly an influence.
I don't even know how to describe it, but it's the oddest comic. But one issue, I think it was in one of those articles, mentions that one of the costume designs sent in by Gilbert Hernandez.
Yes.
Okay, so this was actually getting read around. It's not
Yeah.
as obscure as it seems now.
And Love and Rockets is another thing which has clearly had its cultural moment.
Yes.
And the Hernandez clan are known as like this great comic producing family, but by the same token, we don't talk about Love and Rockets as much as we should.
No,
You read interviews with, let's have it, our one per episode, Kumar, we already addressed him, but let's get it in there. Alan Moore, you read interviews with him in the 80s, and he's going on about Love and Rockets. He's going, people should be reading Love and Rockets. This is really, really good. But
there was an explosion, I'm going to say about 2010 or 2014 when Love Bunglers came out, and that's when suddenly people were talking about Love and Rockets again for a hot minute. And then it's kind of, they're still out there just pumping away again. But it's... Yeah.
I like the chapter all about Neil the Horse. You provided me access to some of that, so I'm going to check out Neil the Horse.
A lot of this stuff is not accessible.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff talked about in the book. So Neil the Horse had a recent printing in 2017, a full collection from some Nova Scotia press or something.
Right.
But some stuff, I had to go into the dark web for some of that Moench stuff, and the Angel of I didn't read, but it's where you can't find it, And some of this stuff's published by DC Marvel, but it's not on Comixology.
That's the value of this book as well.
Yes.
I think it's seeding the ground for people to go and check out some of these works and actually explore, these roads not taken.
Yeah.
But
you're going to have to dig to find some of it.
Yeah, Maheen Ahmed... Breath Chapter, Neil the Horse, and Suppressed Comics Memory. I'm potentially not comfortable dropping this point, but the creator of Neil the Horse is, I think for citation reasons, but still not entirely happy about it, dead named at one point, which is I know it's a difficult conversation, but I wondered if there was another way of Ahmed maybe doing that.
Well, this is interesting because this is an academic text.
Right, yeah.
Published by an academic press, right?
Yes.
And I'd never heard of dead naming until... One of the things I love about hanging out with you, Emmett, is I learn something new every time about cutting-edge culture.
Right.
Which I have no idea about.
Let's not flatter ourselves.
Well, I'm like, what is this? I think it might be, maybe it's coming from the Twitterverse, I don't know, but I'm like, you sent me this link about dead naming, I'd never heard of it before, and I was like, oh, okay, that's what that is. But yeah, it must be really a new thing that they didn't pull that up here. I
thought though maybe it could have been done better.
Okay.
At any rate, Collins, I support her work. I'm really curious about reading this. I'd love to check it out. The other one we wanted to quickly touch on was the women's comics chapter all about Dori Seda.
Yeah, so...
Now, you mentioned before how difficult it is to find things. Dori Seda, I'm obsessed with her now. Yeah. I want to read this. This is amazing. Yeah. The concept of her doing a sex comic where the characters are disgusted by her and leave the comic because leave her in shame. Amazing concept. I immediately finished the chapter, went online. Where is this?
Where is it?
$300. Maybe, if you want to pay that.
Yeah, I think there's some $50 ones on eBay if you're lucky. But Tom Spurgeon, I Googled one of the Google hits was Tom Spurgeon had written about it as being a really crucial comic that you should read.
Yeah.
And I was like, I went on the dark web again. I was like, where can I download this or something? And it's just
That's
no,
crazy.
you got to find the $50 to dish out for this thing.
Crazy.
And
it's so sad because we lost her. She died very young.
Pneumonia, I think, before she was 40 or something, something like that, yeah.
And then her mother was her executor.
Yeah.
And she... Well, I mean, given that so many of the comics are about sexual shame, I find it fascinating. The mother then refused to publish the comics out of shame at her daughter. She argued that it was purely commercial smut.
Yeah.
But yeah, the look that I'm showing Kumar. It's a page from Dori Seda's Fuck Story in Lowly Nights, Last Gasp in 1986. But this is the one where the characters actually walk off the panel.
Yeah.
They walk off the page and leave Dori saying, oh, you're disgusting, you're perverse. Yeah. But yeah, her partner apparently got the rights and was able to publish it, but I haven't been able to find a copy.
No, and that's an interesting thing to come out of the 80s, because like I was saying, that was more of a 70s to be that extreme, explicit. Was more of a 70s thing. I mean,
well, it's counter because it's not your Robert Crumb sort of wallowing in it. It's actually framed as the male characters in this comic scenario being disgusted by her.
Yeah,
So it's the opposite, because in the Robert Crumb, it's like, you know, let's let it all hang out, you know, like, wallow in my fantasy. Whereas here, she's saying, no, you can't, you won't allow me to do that.
Right.
Like, I don't even have the ability to do that as a woman creator.
Right.
I'm like, that's why I'm finding this
But I
fascinating.
will say women's comics is available on Comixology because Fantagraphics published a complete box set, and that's available digitally, and there's a lot of her work in it.
Great.
But not Lonely Nights. That's Last Gasp doesn't... I don't know what their deal is, but there's a lot of her... I mean, women's comics beginning to end is really... They even had a 3D issue. And it's an awesome thing. And there's not really... Again, that's the thing they don't really talk about. They don't talk about the quality of stuff. I would say that's... You know, it's an anthology. Even if there's something weak, something great will come along. 3 pages.
Yeah.
Totally worth it.
Yeah, like they mentioned people like Joyce Farmer and stuff, and like I've loved her later stuff. Like she's come up with something in the last decade, which is just really good.
So many giants in the 80s were in there, like Carol Tyler, Julie Doucette, Mary Fleener, all the biggest, awesomest female artists you can think of were in that anthology in the 80s, and it's. That was one of the things you kind of, in this book, you don't really get a sense of the epicness of it, because they're so laser focused. So yeah, I mean, that goes back to what you said before about how it could have been a lot. There could have been a lot more on any one of those topics. Yeah,
but I do want to note that the introduction to this collection, which is written by Costello and Cremins, Avenues of Free Thought and Fellow Feeling, US Comic Books in the 1980s, it's a fantastic discussion of the whole project, of the concept, of this notion of a curated version of our past, which obscures and hides away and buries elements that the cultural space is not comfortable with. I mean, that as a sort of statement of intent for this collection of essays, that opening introduction is just really, really good. And I would recommend getting this book just for that essay alone. Like, it's just a really great starting point if you want to educate yourself on what's going on.
I would also say the introduction suggests that you should read the whole book in order, beginning to end, which we didn't do.
We did not do.
But it does suggest that there's an overall picture that starts to form if you read them in order. And
certainly I've already picked up on that with the Neil DeHorst mentions and the Trina Robbins mentions. I could see how they're weaving in and out of the work. You know, I think let's quickly look at the contents list. So we've mentioned Doug Moench, Elfquest, Neil DeHorst, P. Greg Russell's Salome and Peneus and Melisandre. P. Greg Russell's early stuff is amazing. Steve Gerber's Stuart the Rat.
Yeah, interesting choice.
Eclipse Enterprises, Entertainment Should Be Adventure, Raggy Byers, Shuriken, and the Black and White Boom. There you go.
You're right. We just didn't read it. But actually, that's interesting because you look at the Shuriken art in that article and it looks really amateurish, which is what the Black and White Boom was.
Yes,
people really weren't at prime time level yet, but we're publishing, yes. So you're right, it is covered.
There's another toyetic chapter, another Toy Story, the Micronauts ROM and Capitalist Epic.
Yeah.
Andrew Hoberick. Now, was it Micronauts is famous for, what's his face?
Michael Golden?
Yeah. And the chap who, he was a Marvel mainstay and he had a horrible accident rollerblading and he's been bedbound for the last couple of decades.
Emmet figured out later that Bill Mantlo was the name he was trying to think of.
Anyway, people are screaming at their computers right now listening. I apologize. But he basically took the opportunity to do his version of New Gods with Micronauts. He just decided to go all Kirby.
Yeah. Ditko did some work on ROM as well, so it's a real oddball.
The other chapter I'm really interested in is Meg King's graphic representations of Vietnam syndrome, race and masculinity in the Nam. Larry Hama. I love Larry Hama's work.
Michael Golden on that as well. Maybe I'm wrong about Micronauts. But Michael Golden definitely did work on Nam.
I think he was involved in Micronauts.
And Michael Golden was the guy that the entire Image movement were trying to be Michael Golden. All those Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, they all wanted to be Michael Golden. Or Art Adams, or some combination of the two. He was a really key figure in the 80s, for sure.
There's a chapter all about AIDS epidemic and the AIDS narrative in comics.
Oh, I got to read that one.
Or Smith.
Yep.
Shades and Light, Representational Paradox, and Tim Truman's Scout Saga by Jeremy M. Carnes. The Lark Light Returns, DC's Humorous Heroes of the 1980s, Blair Davis, I assume Captain Carrot's in there.
Yeah.
Where Is My Soil, Miss Mystic and the Anthropocene, Jose Alanis. Metropolis and Dixie, Race, Liberty and the Atlanta of Southern Nights by Brannon Costello, who's the other editor of this collection. Always Another Rainbow, Fans, Comic Publishing, and the Return of Donald Duck, Peter Cullen Bryan. I am waiting for the day an American academic writes a whole piece about the Finnish obsession with Donald Duck and Scrooge McDuck. And, like, they are obsessed.
Interesting.
We, my partner Stevie, like, we stayed at a friend of hers in Finland, in Helsinki, near Helsinki, sorry. And they had all these erotic Donald Duck prints around there. It's amazing.
Okay, bizarre.
The Crusade of the Comics Journal by Robert Hutton.
It might be an interesting one.
Yeah, and then the second women's comics chapter you mentioned by Rachel Orr Miller, Revolution, Girl Style, Later, Intergenerational Feminisms, and a Second Life of Women's Comics in the 1980s. Like, there is some very rich discussions in here. I would hardly recommend this book. I think it's a great read.
I would recommend it with the caveat that it is an academic work, so if you're not used to reading that kind of stuff, it's going to be hard work.
Yeah, maybe...
Because even I some of the articles are like, I'm having trouble parsing the sentence.
Right, yeah.
And all the jargon that's in it. But overall, yeah, really.
Academic writing is something you need to tune into.
Yeah.
But I do think there are milestones for research into this period. I like a recommended reading list here, which is just fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'm really... Cremins and Costello, I think they've done a great job sort of bringing together all these different ideas about that time. And as you say from the introduction, if they've woven through this narrative, this arc for the period, if you follow it, consecutively, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting approach.
Yeah.
I think we're up to our time. Any last thoughts on this book? Or?
No, that's just it. Yeah, if you know how to read academic writing, there's a lot of value in there. I only read 5 chapters, and it's a huge book. It's like more than 300 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and who's it published by? Actually, you should check that out. LSU Press.
Yeah, it's a university press. It's an academic press.
Yeah. And Brian Cremins, as I said before, I mentioned him as the author of Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia, which I'd also highly recommend people check out. And Brian Costello has done Neon Visions, the comics of Howard Chaykin. Oh, well, there we go.
Okay, interesting.
I'm surprised there wasn't. I mean, look, we're telling ourselves, because we only dipped in and out of this for the purpose of this podcast, but yes, I'm surprised there wasn't a Chaykin chapter, but then potentially Chaykin is one of those people who again has been celebrated enough.
Yes.
That these roads not taken are the ones we should be exploring. Not let's rehash Chaykin's outre controversies yet again. Gets a lot of credit for that. As you said, the Image Boys, they're like, oh yeah, we love Chaykin. We love Chaykin. Tits. Yeah.
Let's end it with that word.
I think so.
The Other 1980s, edited by Brian Cremins and Brannon Costello, is published by Louisiana State University Press. You can help Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and all our podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The next Critiquing Comics is coming up this Saturday, as Jason McNamara joins me to discuss an issue of Thready, written by Brandon Hayes and drawn by Utku Javaska. It's a comic about the experience of being bipolar. And another Critiquing Comics next Wednesday. Ryan Cecil Smith and I discuss a mockumentary comic about bodybuilding aliens. It's called Second Place, by Ben Goldsmith and Ed Smith. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.